in this video, I wanted to show you how I like to mark my squares when I'm making 8 at a time half square triangles. This is for the Clayton pattern in this particular case, but you can use this, of course, anytime you're making 8 at a time half square triangles. So in this pattern, we're using big 10.5 inch squares. If I'm using smaller squares for this, I'll often use this Fons and Porter 1/2 inch ruler so it marks the line down the center and then has a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. But in this case, it's not long enough to stretch across my block, so I'm just going to use the lines on my cutting mat instead. And you can certainly use this technique with any size square you might have that will fit on the size of your cutting mat. I have this nice big, I think it's 34 by 22 cutting mat from Havel's that I just love. I'll link to it in the video, in the comments below. But of course, whatever cutting mat you have that has guide marks on it will work just fine. So in the pattern and most patterns will tell you when you're marking your square for 8 at a time half square triangles, you mark one diagonal line and one in the other direction. You can also mark your center lines vertically and horizontally if you want. That's optional. That's just to help you with cutting later on. You're not going to sew next to those, but you for sure will mark the 2 diagonal lines. And then the pattern generally will tell you to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of those 2 lines. In this case, or when I do mine, I prefer instead to mark the seam lines that I'm actually going to be sewing on instead of marking the center line and then having to eyeball or use a marking on my machine to figure out that 1/4 inch. I like to actually just mark the 1/4 inch lines, and then I'm able to just sew directly on top of them. I find that to be more accurate and easier. I don't have to think about it or worry about setting up my machine in any particular way. It takes slightly longer to do the markings to begin with, but I find that in the end, it actually saves me time. So the way that I do that is find a nice big, obvious vertical line on your cutting mat. I'd use, one of the inch marks and put the diagonal of the square along it. So the points at each end are on that vertical guide mark. And then I take my nice long ruler and I line it up with the 1/4 inch marking that's to the right of that vertical point. So you can see I'm a 1/4 inch past that vertical point. And then I take my pen and I mark it. I like to use friction pins for most of my marking. Use whatever pen you prefer. I like to do that, I'm right-handed, so I like to do that right mark first so that I'll move my ruler to the left and do this left mark. You could do them in either order, but if you're right-handed and using a pen like I am, if you do the left mark first, then you're gonna, drag your ruler across it to do the right-hand mark, and you might smear your ink a little bit. It's not the end of the world, but just something to think about. If you're left-handed, obviously you can do them in the opposite order. So now I will go to the 1/4 inch mark on my mat. That is a 1/4 inch to the left of my points, right? So here's my point, 1/4 inch over here. And I'm going to mark this next line. And then I would turn my square and do the same thing going in this diagonal. Ta-da! And then, like I said, if you wanted to do your vertical and horizontal marks, that's just a single line straight down the middle in each direction, because that's just for cutting later, not for sewing purposes. So now you've got your marked square. You have your square that you're going to combine it with. So the marks will go right side up this time. So the right sides are together. This is the wrong side of this one. In this case, it's solid, so it's not a big deal. And because these are larger squares, I like to pin them. If you're using smaller squares that won't shift around as much, pinning's pretty optional, but the big squares can sometimes shift. So I like to just do pins on each side of those marks. And then I would take this to my machine and I will sew, I will sew directly on each of these lines. So all the way across, all the way across, all the way across, all the way across. I like to do that. I like to chain piece all of my squares. So I'll go through and mark all of my squares first and then chain piece them. And I will show you next how I do that. So now we've got our square that's all been stitched. So again, I stitched on directly on top of the 4 lines that we marked earlier. And now we're going to cut this into our 8 half square triangles. So you can do this really in any order you like. I find it usually easiest to cut the vertical and the horizontal center lines first, and then use my cut marks to subcut the other pieces. So in this case, it's a 10.5-inch square, which means that the center mark should be about 5 1/4. I love this ruler from Havel's that I have because it's 6 inches wide, so I can easily do that even with my long ruler. Some of the long rulers are only like 5 inches wide, and this one's nice and wide and has lots of markings on it, which is nice. So anyways, you can double check too, because of course the center line should cross this little square that's in the middle of your stitches, so you can double check that it's correct. And if it looks good, then you can go ahead and slice that right down the middle. I know it's always a little scary to make that first cut. You could turn the whole thing then, and either, make sure it's lined back up, or you can just cut the 2 pieces. You can separate them and cut this and then cut this. But if you get them lined back up, just fine. Or if you have a rotating cutting mat, you can just rotate the whole thing. That's fine too. And you'll cut it in half going the opposite direction. Okay, and now each of these little pieces needs to be cut down the center on the diagonal, so it'll be in between the lines that you marked. You can cut them each individually, you can stack them and cut them whatever you want. You can rely on your mark if you want, or you can just line up your ruler along the diagonal, which is what I tend to do in case your stitch is just a little bit off and one stitch. So each of these little pieces will give you 2 half square triangles. Press them however you want, or however the pattern tells you to do, and you're good to go. And then you'll trim them up, of course, after you've pressed them. But that you know how to trim half square triangles, and perhaps you do, but I thought just in case, maybe it made sense to go ahead and show you a few options. These can work for basically any half square triangle that you might ever want to make. So, and there are a million ways to do it. People have their preferences for what they like, but I'm just going to show you kind of 2 basic options. These will work whether your seams are pressed open or to the side. That's mostly a matter of personal preference, or sometimes what the pattern tells you. But whichever way your seam is pressed, these will still work. So in this case, I have one that I've already pressed open. This is one of the ones I just made. Seam is pressed open but again, if it was pressed to the side, that would be fine too. We're trimming to 4 3/4 in this case. So I've marked the 4 3/4 lines on my ruler just to give me a visual reference. You can mark down the whole way if you want, but I find usually just kind of marking the corners is sufficient. And this is a 6.5-inch ruler from Havel's that I really love, and it's got a nice 45-degree line straight down the middle as well. So what you'll want to do is line it up so that that 45-degree line is going to follow your seam line down the middle, and then adjust it until, you know, to make sure that all of your fabric is going to fall outside that 4 3/4 inch square. So once it's lined up and it looks good and you're going to have plenty of room, then you can go ahead and trim on the right and the top. Okay. And you can rotate your square. If you have a rotating cutting mat, great, just turn it on around. And now you're going to line up these two sides with your 4 3/4 inch marks. Double check that that 45-degree line is still on your seam, which it should be. And once everything's set, hold that firmly and go right and top, and you're all set. Beautiful. So another option you have is to cut to trim it before you even press it open. This is nice because you only have to trim 2 sides because you're trimming 2 sides at a time, instead of having to trim 1, 2, and then 1, 2. So in this case, you're going to keep it unpressed before you trim. So don't press it, keep it just like this. You've got, you know, your seam that you can see that you had marked and then sewn on top of. Use the same markings, but in this case, I'm going to line up these markings with my seam line. So this little mark is falling on my seam line, and we're going to adjust until both marks fall on the seam line. So not the edge, not this outside edge, the bias edge of the triangle, but on the actual seam line that you stitched a minute ago. And then make sure, of course, that you've got fabric extending out on both the top and the right side. Okay, and so you can kind of adjust until you've got all that set up, and then you're going to go ahead and trim. You'll trim the right and the top. Okay. Now then, of course, if I'm going to press this open in a second, I'm still going to have those dog ears. So you can either press at this point and then trim the dog ears with your scissors or your rotary cutter, or you can go ahead and take care of trimming them off now. To do that, you will rotate your triangle so it's facing the opposite way and line up the outside edge with that 4 3/4 in this case. It would be whatever the size of the half square triangle that you're trimming to is. But in this case, it's 4 3/4 with the outside edge of your triangle. And then you can go ahead and just trim those little dog ears off. And when you press open, then they'll already be gone. So I'll show you. You'll press open and they're already be gone and you're all set to go. No more trimming needed. And you can just make 5 million of these, you know, give or take, to finish your pattern.